Despite Jim Leach's success thus far, statesmen might not be the most effective messengers for encouraging public civility. Just last week, on the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, former President Bill Clinton warned us that, quote, "The words we use really do matter. They fall on the serious and the delirious alike," end quote. His contention that those who would produce inflammatory messages are responsible for violence, for the violence that results afterwards, was immediately criticized by Rush Limbaugh and some other commentators who argued that Clinton's own rhetoric has fueled violence now and in the past. Although it is critical for leaders to question or condemn dangerous speech, and many people are calling on politicians to do just that, the intensity of the current political moment means that leaders who would urge civility risk bringing on a war of words just by saying it. The situation and the context are so fraught that it's hard to know if leaders will be effective. This leads to my second example, which highlights a grassroots approach to defining and enforcing norms for public discourse. One grassroots approach is called Not in Our Town, and it's gaining adherents around the United States. And they just launched a website, so I'm happy to put that up there. This organization started in the mid-1990s in Billings, Montana, where residents came together to respond to acts of vandalism and hate speech against Native American families and Jewish families. Margaret McDonald worked with community members to craft a response to those attacks and to show support for the targeted groups. Their experiences led to 3 guiding principles that continue to be publicized by the Not in Our Town movement. And I'll just read those quickly because I think they're really important insights. The first principle was that we decided hate speech should not be ignored simply because it came from kids. The second principle we realized was that the targeted communities of hate groups were going to be watching very closely to see how the rest of the town was responding. The third principle we worked by was to focus the energy of the community not so much on the perpetrators, but rather on their targets, and find significant ways to publicly stand with them. When a house with a menorah depicting celebrating the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah was vandalized, McDonald's group distributed drawings of menorahs that hundreds of Billings residents, regardless of religion, put up in their windows to express solidarity. McDonald calls the work of her group creative, nonviolent jiu-jitsu, and they have lots of different kinds of tactics they use. Just briefly, because I think some here will be familiar, a number of Not in Our Town groups have confronted Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church. And I gather that they made an appearance here in Richmond and perhaps even here at the museum. And the Not in Our Schools groups that students have started have been incredibly effective in doing this kind of counter. And this is one picture of students who are doing this. Teachers confirm that it's an extraordinary teaching moment through which students can come to understand organizing for change, creative protest, and civil liberties. We can't ignore the claim by some that we're in a climate where emotions are so frayed, divisions so deep, and the stakes so high that people like Phelps break even the most hallowed of norms of speech, perhaps because they see no other way to promote the change they desire. My colleagues and I in the conflict field know that conflict sometimes emerges from deeply cherished beliefs or interests. Conflict brought on by speech that crosses a line has sometimes led to positive social transformation. And we tend to support strongly society members expressing their political and social views, especially when they use creative, nonviolent protest. But we also urge them to find common ground when it's possible and to adhere to democratic values when it's not. And this leads me to my third and final example, which draws on my experience as an educator in Virginia's public university system. Some of us have noticed that our entering classes of students are increasingly strident in their views. The freshmen in my honors class last fall were very polarized in expressing their beliefs about many issues, not just political. And what surprised me was their belief that highly argumentative speech is an appropriate and effective form of rhetoric. Common ground was very, very seldom found. So what I've described is not unique to George Mason students, and I can say that many students were pleased and relieved to learn how to present their views in less oppositional ways. And this is the kind of project that we have in a conflict analysis and resolution program. We ask students to learn how to use language in ways that can get around kind of opposing viewpoints. And just a few of the techniques that we use, we ask them to reframe toward finding common ground when they confront opposing views. We get them to practice responding to hate speech and turning discussions around. And finally, just I'll mention the last example, we have engaged a number of people in long-term dialogue around contentious issues. My colleagues brought together interfaith groups in the Northern Virginia area right after the attacks of September 11th, and engaged them in coming together every couple of weeks just to talk about how they were feeling about what was going on. And some of those groups are still going today, and participants have insisted that they were life-saving and life-changing. I will say, though, that we have had great difficulty getting such dialogue started over the immigration issues. It's been very difficult, and you can feel the level of tension. But with various techniques and creativity in the use of language and norms, it's possible. Let me get quickly to my conclusion. It was very distressing to learn last week of a hate speech incident involving George Mason students, some of our own students. There was racist graffiti, and some anonymous language was sent around the web that was very disparaging of diversity and different ethnic groups on campus. The administration weighed in with an email to everyone at George Mason in our community, and their characterization of the problem and the solution is laudable. And let me just read it. In a multicultural society, we can all expect to be offended at some point by the language and deeds of others. That fact, along with broad First Amendment protections within the U.S. Constitution, does not mean that our university should excuse or condone the anonymous rants intended to degrade a person or group of people. Our community is smarter than that. Our community is bigger than that. Our community is stronger than that. End quote. The administration used the occasion also to remind us that the George Mason community embodies many values: a supportive environment, freedom from harassment, a culture of inclusion. More norms about speech, more speech about norms. This is the approach that they took. The quote tacks between constitutional protection of speech and community norms for speech. This kind of navigation through law and norms is not easy. Lawyers play a key role in accomplishing this in precise and effective ways. It would be helpful for those familiar with the law to use this special expertise to help articulate norms for productive speech in other settings, in the new media, in professional organizations, in religious communities, and in general public discourse, articulating the rules that preserve First Amendment rights, but also express community norms and values, requires the wordsmithing of legal professionals committed to civil discourse. And lawyers might also lead in the hard task of helping to find common ground for discussing the hardest issues of our day. So I'm challenging all of us to try to think about how to do that in our groups later on. A final word. I'm not a Pollyanna who thinks that we can always find common ground and talk out any issue. Having survived a violent attack emerging out of hate, I'm under no illusion that the differences between the US government and Al-Qaeda would be resolved by sitting down to talk. But as we discuss trials and alternative responses to acts of terror and other extraordinarily difficult issues we face as a society, as members of this society, we need to be able to hear one another and to be heard and not be afraid. And I'll just leave you with some words from George Mason himself, great Virginia patriot. Thank you very much. much.